I never believed in fate until the moment I stood before the Vampire Queen's throne, feeling the weight of 1,000 crimson eyes upon me. My name is Cale Theron, and I was nothing more than a human emissary, a messenger sent from the Southern Territories to negotiate a fragile peace treaty between our mortal kingdom and the ancient vampire dominion of Crystalmere. The journey alone had taken 3 weeks through frost-bitten mountain passes and shadowed valleys where sunlight seemed to die before reaching the ground. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Tales of the vampire Queen Seraphine, the immortal ruler who had reigned for over 1,000 years, whose beauty was said to be as deadly as winter itself, whose mercy was as rare as summer snow in her frozen domain. But stories, I learned that day, were pale shadows compared to the reality that awaited me within those crystalline walls. The palace of Crystalmere was not built, it was grown. Enormous pillars of translucent ice rose from the ground like the bones of sleeping giants, each one pulsing with an inner light that shifted between pale blue and ghostly white. The architecture defied human understanding, with arches that seemed to float without support and bridges made of frozen mist that somehow held solid beneath my boots. Every surface reflected and refracted light in impossible ways, creating the illusion that I was walking through a maze of mirrors made from captured moonlight. The temperature was cold enough to make my breath visible, yet strangely, I didn't feel the biting chill I expected. It was as if the palace itself regulated the air around me, keeping me alive just long enough to serve whatever purpose I was meant to fulfill. I had been escorted by silent guards, vampires clad in armor so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their faces were hidden behind helmets shaped like the skulls of wolves, and they moved with an unnatural grace that made no sound against the crystal floors. Not once did they speak to me. Not once did they even acknowledge my questions. They simply guided me through corridors that twisted and turned in ways that made me lose all sense of direction, until finally, we emerged into the throne hall. The throne hall was vast beyond comprehension. The ceiling stretched so high above me that it vanished into darkness, despite the countless floating orbs of cold light that drifted through the air like trapped stars. The walls were lined with hundreds of vampires, nobles I assumed, judging by their elaborate clothing and the staffs they carried, each topped with a different gemstone that glowed with its own eerie color. They stood perfectly still, perfectly silent, their eyes tracking my every movement as I was led down the central aisle toward the throne itself. And there she was. Queen Seraphine sat upon a throne carved from a single massive block of ice that seemed to generate its own internal blizzard. Snowflakes swirled within the frozen structure, never melting, never settling, eternally dancing in their crystalline prison. She wore a gown that appeared to be woven from silver starlight and winter mist, fitted perfectly to a form that was both terrifyingly beautiful and inhumanly perfect. Her skin was the color of fresh snow, flawless and luminous. Her hair cascaded down past her shoulders in waves of platinum blonde so pale it was almost white, adorned with a crown of black ice and blue diamonds. But it was her eyes that truly captured me, ancient crimson orbs that held centuries of knowledge, power, and something else I couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was loneliness. Perhaps it was hunger. Or perhaps it was simply the cold calculation of a predator examining her prey. I knelt as protocol demanded, my armored coat, a gift from my own king enhanced with protective enchantments, felt suddenly inadequate against the supernatural presence that filled the room. The dark, futuristic design of my attire, with its reinforced plates and subtle blue energy lines running through the fabric, marked me as someone important in my own kingdom. But here, in this frozen palace of eternal night, I felt like a child playing dress-up in his father's armor. Cale Theron of the Southern Territories, her voice rang out, clear and cold as breaking ice. You have traveled far to bring us words of peace. Speak them, and let us determine whether your king's promises hold any warmth, or if they are as hollow as the wind. I rose, keeping my eyes respectfully lowered, and began my rehearsed speech. I spoke of trade agreements and border treaties, of shared enemies and mutual benefits. I presented scrolls sealed with my king's signet and offered gifts of rare metals mined from our southern mountains. Throughout it all, Queen Seraphine remained motionless, her expression unreadable, her court equally silent and still. It was like performing for an audience of beautiful statues, and with each passing moment, I felt my confidence draining away like water through cupped hands. I was halfway through explaining the proposed terms of magical resource sharing when I heard it, a sound so unexpected in that silent hall that I nearly lost my place in my speech. Footsteps. Quick, light footsteps. Running. The entire court seemed to shift, a ripple of awareness passing through the assembled vampires like wind through wheat. The temperature in the hall somehow dropped even further, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Something was happening, something unplanned, and judging by the sudden tension crackling through the air like static before a lightning strike, it was something significant. I turned my head slightly, breaking protocol, unable to resist the urge to see what had caused such a reaction. She burst into the throne hall like a winter storm given form. A young woman, no, not a woman, a vampire, I could tell by the way she moved, too fast, too graceful, with hair the color of freshly fallen snow touched by moonlight. It cascaded down her back in silky waves that seemed to glow with their own internal light. She wore a gown of deep blue and silver, far simpler than her mother's, but elegant nonetheless, and upon her head sat a delicate tiara of white gold and sapphires. Her skin was pale as death but radiant with an otherworldly vitality, and her eyes, oh, her eyes were the deepest crimson I had ever seen, like wine made from roses, like the last light of sunset on fresh blood, filled with an emotion so raw and powerful that I felt it strike me like a physical blow even from across the vast hall. She was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, in a way that seemed impossible, in a way that made me forget for a moment where I was and what danger I was in. But that wasn't what froze the entire palace. What froze the palace was what she did next. She ran. Not toward her mother, not toward the throne, but toward me. Her footsteps echoed in the silence like hammer blows, each one sending a shock wave of disbelief through the assembled court. I saw vampires' eyes widen, the first expression of surprise I had seen on any of their faces. I saw guards tense, hands moving toward weapons they hadn't needed to draw in centuries. I saw nobles exchange shocked glances, their eternal composure cracking like thin ice over a dark lake. And I stood there, frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think, as this vampire princess closed the distance between us with impossible speed. "You!" she cried out, her voice breaking with emotion, carrying a mixture of joy and relief and desperate need that I couldn't begin to understand. "You came." Before I could react, before I could even process what was happening, she collided with me, her arms wrapping around my torso with surprising strength, her face pressing against my chest, her entire body trembling against mine. The impact should have knocked me backward, but she held me steady, clinging to me as if I were a lifeline and she was drowning in an ocean of ice. I felt the entire world stop. The palace didn't just grow silent. It became a vacuum of sound, as if every voice, every breath, every heartbeat had been suddenly erased from existence. The very air seemed to solidify around us, thick and heavy with shock and danger and something else, something electric that made every hair on my body stand on end. I stood stiff as a statue, arms at my sides, not daring to move, not daring to breathe, acutely aware of every point where her body touched mine, of the supernatural coldness of her skin that somehow didn't feel cold at all, of the way her fingers clutched the fabric of my armored coat as if letting go would mean losing something precious beyond measure. My eyes, wide with disbelief and growing terror, looked down at the crown of silver hair pressed against my chest. I could see the delicate points of her ears, the graceful curve of her neck, the way her shoulders shook with emotion I couldn't name. Who was she? Why was she doing this? And more importantly, why did some small, insane part of me not want her to let go? Slowly, fighting every instinct screaming at me to look away, I raised my gaze. The vampire queen had risen from her throne. Seraphine stood at her full height, and I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that she was taller than I had thought, more imposing, more dangerous. Her crimson eyes, which had been cold and calculating before, now blazed with an inner fire that seemed to illuminate the entire hall. Her expression was carefully controlled, but I could see the fury burning beneath the surface, could see the shock that even 1,000 years of life hadn't prepared her for this moment, could see something else. Was it fear? Flickering in the depths of those ancient eyes. The court remained frozen, every vampire noble and guard locked in place as if time itself had stopped. But their eyes, hundreds of glowing eyes in shades of red and green and amber, all focused on us, on this impossible tableau, on the human man being embraced by the vampire princess while the queen watched with barely restrained emotion that could explode into violence at any moment. Lyra, the queen's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. It was quiet, controlled, but underneath that control I heard something that made my blood run cold. Anger, yes, but also hurt and confusion, and the dangerous unpredictability of a mother whose child has just done something incomprehensible. What are you doing? The girl, Lyra, apparently didn't let go. If anything, her grip tightened, and I felt her take a shuddering breath against my chest. When she spoke, her voice was muffled but clear enough for everyone in that vast hall to hear. I'm saving him, Mother. Just like he saved me. The silence that followed her words was somehow even deeper than before. I felt my mind racing, trying to make sense of what she had said. Saved her? I had never seen this girl before in my life. I had never even been to the vampire territories until this diplomatic mission. There had to be some mistake, some confusion, some... Explain yourself. Now. The queen's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. Lyra finally, slowly, loosened her grip on me, though she didn't step away. Instead, she turned to face her mother while keeping one hand firmly clasped around my arm, as if anchoring herself to me, or perhaps anchoring me to this moment, preventing me from fleeing as every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to do. Her face, when I could finally see it properly, was stunning and tragic all at once. Those crimson eyes were filled with tears that caught the floating lights and sparkled like rubies, and her expression held a desperate sincerity that cut through my confusion and fear. She looked young, perhaps 16 or 17 in human years, though with vampires, I knew appearance meant nothing about actual age. She could have been decades old or centuries, frozen at the cusp of adulthood for eternity. Mother, please, Lyra began, her voice trembling but determined. I know this seems impossible, but I need you to listen. I need everyone to listen. She turned slightly, addressing the court, though she never released my arm. 5 years ago, when I was captured by the Crimson Fangs cult, when they took me from the eastern border and brought me to their underground temple to use my blood for their forbidden rituals, you all remember, don't you? You remember how I was missing for 3 months, how you searched every shadow and corner of the realm, how you went to war with the cult and destroyed them utterly. A murmur ran through the court, the first sound they had made since this bizarre scene began. I saw the queen's expression flicker, pain crossing her perfect features before being locked away behind her mask of control again. Mother nearly tore the world apart looking for me, Lyra continued, and now her voice grew stronger, more confident. But the cult had hidden me well, in places warded against tracking magic, in chambers deep beneath the earth where no light reached. And when they began the ritual, when they chained me to that altar and started drawing my blood drop by drop, feeding it to the darkness they were trying to summon, I prayed. I prayed to every god I knew, even the human ones, even though I had been taught that they held no power over our kind. I prayed for someone, anyone, to help me. She turned to look at me then, and the intensity in her gaze made me forget how to breathe. And you came, she whispered. A human boy, no more than 14 years old, stumbling into that chamber by accident, lost and terrified and bleeding from your own wounds. You looked at me chained to that altar, looked at the cultists beginning their chant, and you didn't run. You didn't abandon me to save yourself. You attacked them. My mind spun, reaching back through my memories, searching for something, anything that matched what she was describing. 5 years ago. I would have been 14. There had been an incident. Raiders had attacked my village on the southern border. My family had been killed. I had fled into the mountains, wounded and desperate, seeking shelter in the caves. I had found something. A chamber. Stone and darkness and torches burning with green fire. There had been people in robes, chanting in a language I didn't understand. And there had been, oh gods, the girl on the altar. The memory came flooding back, sharp and vivid despite the years that had buried it. I had forgotten, or perhaps I had forced myself to forget, had convinced myself it was a fever dream born from blood loss and trauma. But now looking at Lyra's face I remembered. Silver hair spread across black stone. Crimson eyes filled with pain and terror. Chains made of some dark metal that seemed to drink light. And so much blood, her blood pooling beneath the altar, running in rivulets along carved channels in the stone, feeding into a circle of runes that pulsed with sickly light. I had been half dead myself, armed with nothing but a rusty knife taken from one of the raiders who had killed my family. I should have run. Any sane person would have run. But I had seen the girl's eyes, had seen her silent plea, and something in me, something I couldn't explain then and still couldn't explain now, had made me move. I had attacked. Surprise had been my only advantage. The cultists hadn't expected a wounded human child to come charging out of the darkness, screaming defiance. I had managed to kill 2 of them before they overwhelmed me. I remembered pain, remembered being thrown against the wall, remembered the taste of blood in my mouth and the feeling of my ribs breaking. I remembered seeing more cultists converging, remembered thinking that I had failed, that we were both going to die in that horrible place. And then I remembered light. Blinding, terrible, beautiful light erupting from the girl on the altar, from Lyra, as the chains binding her shattered. The cultists had screamed. There had been blood and chaos and then nothing. I had woken up 3 days later in a village hospital, alone, with wounds that should have killed me somehow healed enough that I survived. The authorities had investigated the cave but found nothing. No bodies, no altar, no evidence that anything had happened there at all. They had assumed my story was the delusion of a traumatized, injured boy. Eventually I had assumed the same. But it had been real. I looked at Lyra with new eyes, seeing past the regal bearing and the vampire princess standing before me, seeing instead the terrified girl chained to an altar, and understanding bloomed in my chest like a painful flower. "You saved me that day," Lyra said softly, her words meant for me alone, though in the absolute silence of the hall, everyone could hear them. "Your foolish, brave, impossible attack disrupted the ritual just enough, broke their concentration just long enough for me to access my power and break free. I killed them all, every cultist in that chamber, in the rage and terror of the moment. And when I was done, when I stood there covered in their blood, I looked for you. But you were gone. There was a trail of blood leading out of the chamber, and I followed it, desperate to find you, to thank you, to save you as you had saved me. But by the time I reached the village, you had been taken to healers and there were humans everywhere and dawn was coming and her voice broke. I had to leave. I had to return home. My mother had finally located me and the guards came, and they dragged me back to safety while I screamed your name, a name I didn't even know, to a face I had only seen for moments in the darkness. Tears rolled down her cheeks now, glowing slightly in the cold light, and she made no move to wipe them away. I've searched for you ever since. I described you to artists, had them create hundreds of portraits from my memory. I sent agents into human lands to search the border villages. I studied human records, human names, human faces. I dreamed of you, of finding you, of being able to properly thank you for giving me my life back. And today, when you walked into this hall, when you knelt before my mother's throne, I thought I was hallucinating. I thought my desperate longing had finally driven me mad. But it was you. It is you. Older, stronger, but the same eyes. The same brave, foolish eyes that looked at a doomed vampire princess and decided she was worth saving, even if it cost you everything. She turned back to her mother, drawing herself up to her full height, still gripping my arm as if she feared I might disappear like smoke if she let go. So yes, mother, I ran to him. I embraced him. Because he is not just some human emissary, he is the human who saved your daughter's life when the entirety of your kingdom could not. And if that breaks protocol, if that shocks the court, if that offends tradition, then I apologize. But I will not pretend I don't owe him everything. I will not dishonor his sacrifice with false formality. The throne hall remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. The shock was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Understanding, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. I saw vampire nobles exchange glances, saw guards lower their hands from their weapons, saw the tension in the room shift from immediate danger to confused uncertainty. And Queen Seraphine, she stood there, staring at her daughter, her expression cycling through emotions too quickly for me to track. Fury gave way to shock, shock gave way to understanding, understanding gave way to something that looked almost like pain, and finally, slowly, her features softened into something I never expected to see on the face of the ancient vampire queen. Relief. She descended from her throne, moving with liquid grace, her gown trailing behind her like captured starlight. The court parted before her, creating a clear path, and within moments she stood before us, before me and the princess who still clung to my arm. Up close, Seraphine was even more terrifying and beautiful than she had been from a distance. She towered over both of us, and the power radiating from her presence made my knees weak. But when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle. "Lyra," she said, reaching out to cup her daughter's cheek with one pale hand. "My precious child. Why did you never tell me about the boy? Why did you never speak of him?" Lyra leaned into her mother's touch, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Because I didn't know if I would ever find him. Because I thought you might try to stop me from searching, might think it was an unhealthy obsession, might forbid me from pursuing someone who might not even survive his injuries. And I couldn't bear the thought of being ordered to forget him, to stop looking, to let go of the one person who had valued my life over his own without even knowing who I was." Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, her crimson eyes studying her daughter's face with an intensity that spoke of complicated emotions warring within her. Then, slowly, she turned her gaze to me. I wanted to look away. Every instinct screamed at me to drop my eyes, to show submission, to do anything other than meet the stare of a 1,000-year-old vampire queen who could end my life with a thought. But something, pride or perhaps the same foolish bravery that had driven me into that chamber 5 years ago, kept my gaze steady. "Cale Theron," she said, and hearing my name from her lips felt surreal, intimate in a way that made me uncomfortable. "It seems I owe you a debt beyond measure. You saved my daughter's life when I could not. You faced death to protect her when you had no reason to do so, when doing so brought you no benefit and only guaranteed your own destruction. That is not the action of a mere messenger or diplomat. That is the action of someone with a hero's heart." She paused, and I saw something shift in her expression, saw a decision being made behind those ancient eyes. "Tell me, Cale Theron of the Southern Territories, what reward would you ask for such a deed? Gold? Land? Power? Name it, and if it is within my considerable means to grant, I shall see it done." I opened my mouth, then closed it again, my mind racing. What did I want? I had come here as an emissary, yes, but I was also just a survivor of a border raid who had gotten lucky enough to be chosen for this mission because of my knowledge of the mountain passes. I had no great ambitions, no secret desires for wealth or power. I had simply been trying to survive, to find purpose in a world that had taken everything from me 5 years ago. But looking at Lyra, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression, feeling the warmth of her hand still wrapped around my arm despite the supernatural chill of her skin, I found myself saying words I hadn't planned, hadn't even known I was thinking until they left my mouth. "I want to understand," I said quietly. "I want to know why. Why I survived when I should have died. Why I healed when my wounds were fatal. Why I felt this strange pull, this incompleteness for the past 5 years without knowing what I was missing." And I hesitated, then pushed forward, knowing I might be overstepping but unable to stop myself. "I want to know her. The girl I saved. The princess she became. I want to know if the glimpse I saw in that chamber, the strength and the terror and the desperate will to live, if that was real or just a moment born from darkness and fear." The queen's eyebrows rose slightly, and I thought I detected the faintest hint of amusement touching the corners of her perfect lips. "You want to stay then? Here in Crystalmere? You want to remain in my court, in my daughter's presence?" It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "If you'll permit it, Your Majesty. The peace treaty I came to negotiate, I believe in it. I believe our peoples can find common ground. And perhaps I can serve as a bridge between our worlds, as someone who has already crossed the divide between human and vampire in the most unexpected way." Lyra's grip on my arm tightened, and when I glanced at her, I saw such naked hope in her expression that it made my chest ache. She looked to her mother with pleading eyes, and I realized that despite her earlier boldness, she was still young, still dependent on her mother's approval in ways that transcended her vampire nature. Seraphine was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving between me and her daughter, weighing factors I couldn't begin to guess at. The entire court held its collective breath, waiting for the Queen's decision. Finally she spoke. "Very well. Cale Theron, I accept your request, and I grant you permission to remain in Crystal Mere as my daughter's companion." She stressed the last word in a way that made it clear she was choosing it carefully, defining the bounds of our relationship before it could become something scandalous or dangerous. "You will serve as an ambassador of sorts, a liaison between our peoples, and you will help facilitate the peace treaty your king desires. But more than that, you will help my daughter find closure for the trauma she endured, and perhaps in doing so, help yourself find whatever answers you seek." She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried throughout the entire hall. "But understand this, human. My daughter is precious to me beyond all measure. She is the only child I have borne in 1,000 years of life, the only being in this world I love without reservation or condition. If you bring her harm, if you betray her trust, if you abuse the faith she has placed in you, I will make you wish you had died in that chamber 5 years ago. I will drag out your death for decades, and your suffering will become legendary, a cautionary tale told to humans for generations. Do we have an understanding?" I met her eyes, saw the absolute sincerity in her threat, and knew that she meant every word. But I also saw something else, the fear of a mother who had almost lost her child, who was terrified of allowing that child to be vulnerable again, who was taking a massive risk by permitting this impossible connection to continue. "I understand, Your Majesty," I said quietly. "And I swear to you, I would rather die than cause Lyra harm." Something in Seraphine's expression softened fractionally. She straightened, turning to address the court, her voice ringing out with royal authority. "Let it be known throughout Crystal Mere that Cale Theron, formerly of the Southern Territories, is now under my personal protection as a guest of the royal house. He is to be treated with the respect due to one who saved the life of Princess Lyra. Anyone who brings him harm will answer to me personally." The court responded as one, pressing fists to their chests in a gesture of acknowledgement I had seen in historical texts but never witnessed in person. The sound of dozens of armored hands striking armored chests echoed through the hall like distant thunder. And just like that, my life changed forever. The days that followed were among the strangest of my life. I was given quarters in the palace that were far too luxurious for someone of my status. A suite of rooms carved from blue ice that somehow remained solid without being cold, furnished with pieces that looked like they had been crafted by master artisans centuries ago. The bed was impossibly soft, draped in furs from creatures I didn't recognize, and the windows looked out over the vampire city that surrounded the palace, a sprawling metropolis of crystalline spires and frozen bridges lit by thousands of enchanted lights that mimicked stars. I was assigned servants, pale, quiet vampires who attended to my every need with efficient silence, bringing me food prepared by chefs who understood human dietary requirements, providing clothing appropriate to the palace's eternal winter aesthetic, ensuring I had everything I needed to be comfortable in a place that was fundamentally inhospitable to my kind. But most significantly, I was given access to Lyra. She came to me the very next day, arriving at my quarters in the early evening with a nervous energy that seemed at odds with her regal bearing. She wore a different gown than before, this one a deep burgundy that made her pale skin seem to glow and brought out the crimson in her eyes, and her silver hair was arranged in an elaborate braid that fell over one shoulder. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, hovering at the threshold as if unsure of her welcome despite the fact that she was a princess in her own palace and I was merely a guest. "Not at all," I replied, gesturing for her to enter. "I was just trying to understand this place. It's very different from the Southern Territories." She smiled, a real smile, not the formal expression I had seen her wear in the throne hall, and it transformed her face, making her look younger, more vulnerable, more real. "Different doesn't begin to cover it. I've read about human lands, seen paintings and tapestries, but I've never actually traveled beyond our borders. My mother," she paused, pain flickering across her features. "After the incident with the cult, she became very protective. I'm rarely allowed to leave the palace and never without a full guard escort. She fears losing me again. I nodded, understanding the weight of that fear. I can't blame her. From what you described, what happened to you was... I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been. Lyra moved into the room, her movements graceful in that distinctly vampire way that was too smooth to be entirely human. She crossed to the window, looking out at the glowing city below, and for a long moment she was silent. When she spoke again, her voice was soft, reflective. The worst part wasn't the pain or even the fear of death. It was the loneliness. Knowing that I was going to die surrounded by people who hated what I was, who saw me as nothing more than a source of power to be drained and consumed. Knowing that my mother was out there somewhere, searching but unable to find me. Feeling my strength fading drop by drop, my consciousness slipping away, and thinking that my last moments would be in that horrible darkness with only the chanting of my killers to accompany me into oblivion. She turned to face me, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. And then you appeared. This human boy, bleeding and broken, who should have been thinking only of his own survival. You looked at me like I was a person, not a princess, not a vampire, not a prize. Just someone who needed help. And you helped me even though it meant your death. Even though it made no logical sense. Even though... Her voice broke and she wrapped her arms around herself in a gesture that was heartbreakingly vulnerable. Even though you had no reason to care whether I lived or died. I crossed the distance between us without thinking, drawn by the raw emotion in her voice. I stopped just short of her, close enough to reach out if I chose to, but maintaining enough distance to be respectful. I had a reason, I said quietly. Maybe I didn't know it then, maybe I couldn't have articulated it, but I had a reason. You were terrified and in pain, and you were going to die if someone didn't act. That was reason enough. Not for most people, she said, meeting my gaze. Most people would have run. Most people would have chosen their own survival over a stranger's life, especially a stranger who was supposed to be a monster. Because that's what humans are taught about vampires, isn't it? That we're predators, creatures of evil, things to be feared and destroyed. Some humans believe that, I acknowledged. Just as some vampires believe humans are nothing more than cattle, I imagine. But most people, human or vampire, are more complicated than the stories we tell about each other. I learned that young before the raid. My father used to trade with travelers from all over, and he taught me to judge people by their actions, not their nature. So when I saw you on that altar, I didn't see a vampire. I saw a girl who was suffering, who needed help. That's all. Lyra stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. A kind of wonder, as if I had said something profound instead of simply speaking the truth as I understood it. Then, slowly, carefully, she reached out and took my hand in hers. Her skin was cool to the touch, but not unpleasantly so. Her fingers were slender and strong, and they interlaced with mine with a natural ease that felt like it shouldn't be possible given the vast differences between us. We stood there, holding hands in the fading light filtering through the ice crystal window, and I felt a connection forming between us that transcended species and circumstance. A bond forged not in the darkness of that chamber 5 years ago, but here and now in the quiet vulnerability of shared understanding. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for saving my life then, but for choosing to stay now. For wanting to know me, the real me, not just the princess or the victim. She hesitated, then pushed forward with determination. For seeing me as a person just like you did in that chamber. Always, I promised, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Lyra would visit me daily, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, and we would talk. About everything and nothing. About her life in the palace, the endless lessons in history and diplomacy, the formal functions she was required to attend, the weight of being the only heir to an ancient throne. About my life in the Southern Territories, the village I had grown up in, the family I had lost, the years spent recovering and rebuilding after the raid, the training I had undergone to become a diplomatic envoy. We talked about books we had read, discovering a shared love of adventure tales and historical chronicles. We discussed music, and she introduced me to vampire compositions that predated human civilization, haunting melodies played on instruments I had never seen before. We debated philosophy and ethics, finding that despite our different natures, we shared surprisingly similar views on justice and mercy and the responsibilities of power. But we also spent time simply being together in comfortable silence. She would work on her embroidery, a hobby she practiced with surprising dedication, while I studied vampire language and customs from the texts she provided. Or we would walk through the palace gardens, spaces filled with plants that thrived in the perpetual twilight, their leaves and petals glowing with bioluminescent colors that painted the air with shifting rainbows. The palace staff grew accustomed to our companionship, though I still caught curious glances and whispered conversations that cut off abruptly when I came into view. The court accepted my presence with the reserved tolerance that came from royal decree, but I could feel the undercurrent of suspicion and judgment. A human in the vampire palace was unusual enough. A human who spent hours each day in the private company of the princess was scandalous. Queen Seraphine observed it all with an inscrutable expression. She summoned me for private audiences once a week, ostensibly to discuss the progress of the peace treaty negotiations with my kingdom, but I suspected her true purpose was to evaluate my relationship with her daughter. She asked pointed questions about my intentions, my understanding of vampire customs, my plans for the future. I answered as honestly as I could, making no promises I couldn't keep, hiding nothing that she might discover on her own. She never explicitly threatened me again, but I felt the weight of her warning in every conversation. I was allowed to remain because I served a purpose, both diplomatic and personal, but that permission was conditional, always subject to revocation if I failed to meet her unspoken standards. And through it all, my bond with Lyra deepened. It was subtle at first. The way she would lean slightly closer when we walked together, her shoulder occasionally brushing mine. The way her eyes would light up when I entered a room, her expression shifting from courtly composure to genuine pleasure. The way she laughed at my clumsy attempts to master vampire etiquette, a bright, musical sound that I found myself wanting to hear more and more. I felt it too, this growing connection. The way my heart would speed up when I knew I was going to see her. The way I found myself thinking about her during the hours we were apart, remembering things she had said, planning topics to discuss when we next met. The way the palace, which should have felt alien and intimidating, began to feel like home because she was there. But I also felt the complications lurking beneath the surface. The reality that she was a vampire princess and I was a human of common birth. The fact that she would live for centuries, perhaps millennia, while I would age and die in the span of a single lifetime, barely a heartbeat in vampire terms. The knowledge that our peoples had been enemies for generations, and that our friendship, let alone anything deeper, represented a potential scandal that could undermine the fragile peace we were trying to build. I tried not to think about these things. I tried to simply enjoy the time we had, to live in the present without worrying about a future that seemed impossibly complicated. But late at night, lying in my too-soft bed and staring at the eternally frozen ceiling of my chamber, I couldn't escape the questions that plagued me. What were we doing? Where could this possibly lead? And was I being unfair to Lyra by allowing our connection to deepen when I had no idea how to bridge the seemingly insurmountable differences between us? I didn't have answers. But I also couldn't bring myself to pull away, to put distance between us, to protect us both from potential heartbreak by ending things before they truly began. Because the truth was, I was falling for her. Not the vampire princess, not the girl I had saved, but her, Lyra, with her quick wit and her hidden vulnerabilities, her fierce intelligence and her surprising kindness, her regal bearing and her moments of endearing awkwardness when she forgot to maintain her courtly mask. And if the way she looked at me was any indication, she was falling too. The crisis came on a cold evening 2 months after my arrival. I had been summoned to the throne hall for a formal audience. A visiting delegation of vampire nobles from the eastern provinces had arrived, and my presence as the human ambassador was apparently required for some diplomatic purpose I hadn't fully understood. I dressed in the formal attire that had been provided for me, a suit of midnight blue with silver embroidery that marked me as part of the royal household, and made my way through the crystal corridors with a guard escort. The throne hall was packed with vampires, far more than I had seen since that first day. The air buzzed with conversation and the subtle tension of political maneuvering. Queen Seraphine sat upon her throne, regal and terrifying as always, with Lyra standing at her right hand in a gown of ice blue and white that made her look like a winter goddess. The visiting delegation was introduced with great ceremony. They were led by a vampire lord named Draven, a tall, imposing figure with dark hair and amber eyes who carried himself with the arrogance of someone used to getting his way. He approached the throne with his entourage, offered the appropriate gestures of respect, and began speaking about trade agreements and territorial boundaries. I stood off to the side as was appropriate for my position, trying to follow the complex political discussion and understand the subtle power dynamics at play. But my attention kept drifting to Lyra, who stood perfectly still, her expression carefully neutral, her eyes fixed on some point above the delegation's heads. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the tension of her shoulders, the slight tightness around her eyes, the way her hands were clasped together just a bit too tightly. She was uncomfortable, and as I watched, I saw Lord Draven's gaze drift to her repeatedly, studying her with an intensity that made my instincts scream warnings. "And finally, Your Majesty," Draven said, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "I come to discuss a matter of alliance between our houses. As you know, my family has long been loyal to the crown, and we seek to strengthen those ties through a formal union." Queen Seraphine's expression didn't change, but I sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden sharpening of attention from the assembled court. "What sort of union do you propose, Lord Draven?" He smiled, a predatory expression that showed too many teeth. "A marriage, Your Majesty. Between myself and your daughter, Princess Lyra. Such a union would bind the eastern provinces more firmly to the crown, would bring considerable wealth and military strength to the royal house, and would provide Princess Lyra with a suitable partner of her own kind and station." The throne hall erupted in murmurs, some approving, some surprised, all intensely interested. I felt my blood turn to ice, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. I looked at Lyra and saw her go even paler than usual, saw her crimson eyes widen with something that looked like panic before she locked it down behind her courtly mask. "An interesting proposal," Seraphine said carefully, her voice giving nothing away. "Of course, such a matter would require considerable deliberation. Princess Lyra's future is not something to be decided hastily." "Of course, Your Majesty," Draven replied smoothly. "I merely wished to formally present the offer so that you might consider it at your leisure. Though I hope you will agree that the advantages of such a union are clear." He turned to Lyra then, bowing deeply. "Princess, I hope you will allow me the honor of your company during my stay, so that we might become better acquainted." Lyra's jaw tightened, but she managed a polite nod. "As you wish, Lord Draven." The formal audience continued, but I barely heard the rest of it. My mind was racing, emotions churning in my chest that I had no right to feel. Jealousy, anger, fear. And beneath it all, a growing certainty that I couldn't remain silent, that I couldn't simply stand by and watch Lyra be bargained away like a piece in a political game, regardless of the consequences to myself or the peace treaty or anything else. When the audience finally ended and the court began to disperse, I tried to catch Lyra's eye, but she was immediately surrounded by nobles and advisors, swept away in the tide of political maneuvering that had been unleashed by Draven's proposal. I stood there, feeling helpless and furious until a hand touched my shoulder. I turned to find one of Lyra's ladies-in-waiting, a young vampire named Sarah who had been kind to me during my time in the palace. She leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "The princess asks that you meet her in the East Garden at midnight. She says it's urgent." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and Sarah disappeared into the crowd. The hours until midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. I returned to my quarters, paced like a caged animal, tried and failed to focus on anything other than the image of Draven looking at Lyra with proprietary interest. Finally, when the palace bells chimed the midnight hour, I slipped out of my rooms and made my way through the darkened corridors to the East Garden. The garden at night was a place of ethereal beauty. The glowing plants seemed to shine more brightly in the darkness, casting pools of colored light across the pathways. Frost flowers, delicate blooms that only grew in the magical cold of Crystalmere, sparkled like captured stars. And in the center of it all, standing beneath a tree whose branches were hung with luminescent ice crystals, was Lyra. She turned as I approached, and in the soft light, I could see that she had been crying. Vampires, I had learned, did cry, though their tears were tinged with the faintest hint of red, like wine diluted in water. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, her voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to do that. I had no idea." "It's not your fault," I interrupted, closing the distance between us. "You have nothing to apologize for. But Lyra, we need to talk about this. About what that proposal means, about what your mother might decide, about—" I hesitated, then forced myself to continue. "About us." She looked at me with such pain in her crimson eyes that it felt like a physical blow. "There is no us, Cale. There can't be. I'm a vampire princess and you're a human. Even if we wanted something more than friendship, even if we—" Her voice broke and she looked away. "It doesn't matter what we want. My duty is to my people, to the throne, to alliances and politics and all the things I've been trained for since birth. And Draven's offer it's logical. It makes sense from every practical standpoint." "Logic," I said, and I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. "Duty. Politics. What about what you feel? What about your happiness?" "Happiness is a luxury," she whispered. "Princesses don't get to choose happiness over duty. My mother didn't. Her mother didn't. Why should I be any different?" I reached out and took her shoulders gently, turning her to face me. She resisted for a moment, then allowed it, looking up at me with eyes that held centuries of royal resignation despite her young appearance. "Because you deserve to be different," I said fiercely. "Because you're not just a princess or a political tool or a means to an alliance. You're Lyra. You're the girl who survived torture and trauma, who spent 5 years searching for someone she glimpsed in the darkness, who reads adventure stories and practices embroidery and laughs at terrible jokes. You're a person with feelings and desires and dreams that matter just as much as any treaty or alliance. My dreams don't matter if they threaten the stability of the realm," she said, but there was doubt in her voice now, a crack in the wall of duty she had built around herself. "Who says they threaten anything?" I challenged. "Who says that your happiness and the realm's stability are mutually exclusive? Maybe there's another way. Maybe we can find a solution that serves both duty and desire. But we'll never know if we don't try, if we just surrender to the way things have always been done without fighting for what we actually want." "And what do we want, Cale?" she asked softly, dangerously. "Say it plainly. What are we dancing around? What is this thing between us that we're both pretending doesn't exist?" I took a breath, knowing that what I was about to say would change everything, would cross a line we couldn't uncross, would force both of us to confront the truth we had been carefully avoiding. But I also knew I couldn't lie, couldn't hide behind diplomatic language and careful evasions, not anymore, not with her. "I'm in love with you," I said simply. "I'm in love with you and I think you love me too. And I know that's complicated and dangerous and possibly the stupidest thing a human has ever felt for a vampire princess. But it's the truth and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." The silence that followed my confession seemed to stretch for an eternity. Lyra stared at me, her expression cycling through shock and fear and hope and a dozen other emotions I couldn't name. Then, slowly, so slowly it was almost painful to watch, she reached up and placed her hand against my cheek. "You beautiful, foolish, impossible man," she whispered. "Of course I love you. I've loved you since I was a terrified girl on an altar watching you throw yourself at my captors with nothing but a rusty knife and more courage than sense. I've loved you through 5 years of searching and hoping and dreaming. I've loved you since the moment you walked into this palace and I realized that you were real, that you had survived, that I might actually get the chance to know you. And I've fallen more deeply in love with you every day since, even though I knew it was hopeless, even though I knew we could never." I didn't let her finish. I pulled her close and kissed her, and she melted into my arms with a soft sound that was half sob, half sigh. Her lips were cool against mine, her body cold in that distinctly vampire way, but beneath the chill I felt heat, passion, a desperate need that matched my own. We broke apart after a moment that might have been seconds or hours, both breathing heavily, staring at each other with wild eyes and racing hearts. "We can't," Lyra said even as her hands clutched at my clothes, pulling me closer. "My mother will never allow it. The court will revolt. Draven will be insulted and his provinces might rebel. Everything we've worked for, the peace treaty, the alliance with the human kingdoms, it could all fall apart. Then we'll find a way to hold it together, I said firmly. We'll make them understand. We'll prove that love between human and vampire isn't a weakness but a strength, a bridge between our peoples that could lead to genuine unity instead of just political convenience. But Lyra, we have to try. We have to fight for this. Because if we don't, if we just let duty and tradition dictate our lives, we'll spend eternity wondering what might have been, and that's a different kind of death. She looked at me for a long moment and I saw the war playing out behind her eyes. Duty versus desire, tradition versus possibility, fear versus hope. Then, slowly, her expression hardened into determination, and I saw in her face the girl who had broken her chains and destroyed her captors. The princess who had defied protocol to embrace me in front of the entire court. All right, she said quietly. All right. We'll fight. But we have to be smart about this, Kale. We can't just announce our feelings and expect everyone to accept them. We need a strategy. We need allies. We need to show my mother and the court that what we have is real and valuable and not just some fleeting infatuation that will fade with time. How do we do that? I asked. She smiled then, a fierce, determined smile that made her look like the queen she was born to become. We start by showing them what you've already shown me, that human and vampire can trust each other, work together, sacrifice for each other. We make ourselves invaluable to the court, to the realm. We prove that our bond isn't a liability but an asset. And we give my mother a reason to choose love over logic, to take the risk of breaking tradition because the alternative is losing her daughter's happiness. That's a tall order, I said, but I was smiling too, infected by her determination. Good thing we're both too stubborn to know when to give up, she replied. And there, in the luminescent garden beneath the eternal twilight of Crystal Mere, we made our plans, holding hands like children plotting an adventure, our hearts full of hope and love and the kind of defiant courage that makes gods and monsters nervous. We didn't know if we would succeed. We didn't know if the court would accept us, or if the queen would relent, or if the peace between our peoples could survive the scandal of a vampire princess loving a human. But we knew we were going to try, and that was enough. For now it was enough. The next weeks tested us in ways I hadn't imagined. Lord Draven remained in the palace, playing the role of the attentive suitor with practiced ease. He sent Lyra gifts, elaborate pieces of jewelry, rare books, exotic flowers preserved in magical ice. He requested her company at formal dinners and cultural events, always operating within the bounds of propriety but making his intentions clear to everyone watching. The court observed it all with keen interest, speculating about when the queen would make her decision, placing bets on whether the marriage would happen before or after the winter solstice. Through it all, Lyra maintained her composure with a grace I found both impressive and heartbreaking. She accepted Draven's attentions with polite coolness, never encouraging him but never openly rejecting him either, walking the diplomatic tightrope her position required. But I saw the strain it put on her, saw the tightness around her eyes and the way her smiles never quite reached their full potential when she was in his presence. Meanwhile, we threw ourselves into proving our worth to the court and the queen. We worked together on the peace treaty, using our unique perspectives to identify potential areas of conflict and develop solutions that served both human and vampire interests. We organized cultural exchanges, bringing human artists and scholars to the palace to share their work with vampires who had never seen such things, and arranging for vampire historians to visit human universities to share their ancient knowledge. I trained with the vampire guards, learning their fighting techniques and teaching them some human combat styles in return, building bridges of respect and camaraderie. Lyra used her influence to push for reforms that would improve relations between our peoples, opening trade routes, establishing joint patrols in border regions, creating diplomatic channels for resolving disputes without violence. And slowly, gradually we began to see results. Human merchants started arriving at the palace, their goods welcomed by vampire nobles who had never considered trading with lesser beings before. Scholars from both races started collaborating on research projects, discovering that combined human innovation and vampire longevity produced breakthroughs neither could achieve alone. Guards who had eyed each other with suspicion began sharing meals and stories, finding common ground in the universal experience of serving and protecting. The queen watched it all with her inscrutable crimson gaze, saying nothing, but I sensed her attention on us constantly, evaluating every interaction, every decision, every moment of cooperation we facilitated. And through it all, Lyra and I stole moments together whenever we could. We were careful, always maintaining the appearance of propriety in public, never giving the court reason to gossip or the queen reason to separate us. But in private, in the gardens and the library and the quiet corners of the palace where we could speak without being overheard, we allowed ourselves to simply be, not princess and ambassador, not vampire and human, but two people in love trying to navigate an impossible situation. She told me stories of her childhood, of growing up as the only heir to an ancient throne, of the loneliness of being surrounded by courtiers and servants but having no real friends her own age. I shared memories of my family, of the father who taught me to see people as individuals rather than categories, of the mother whose laugh could light up a room, of the younger sister who had looked up to me as if I could do anything. We mourned together for the lives we had lost and the innocence we could never reclaim. And we dreamed together about a future that might be possible if we could just make the right people believe. The confrontation came on a night when the palace was celebrating the Winter's Peak Festival, a vampire holy day that marked the longest night of the year. The throne hall had been decorated with thousands of ice crystals that refracted light in rainbow patterns, and musicians played haunting melodies on instruments made from frozen water and vampire magic. The entire court was present, dressed in their finest, drinking wine made from preserved summer berries and dancing dances that had been perfected over millennia. I stood at the edge of the celebration, watching Lyra move through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting compliments and making conversation, every inch the royal princess. Lord Draven was never far from her side, using the festival as an excuse to remain close, and I felt the now familiar surge of jealousy and frustration watching him. "You wear your heart on your sleeve, human?" I turned to find Queen Seraphine standing beside me, appearing without warning as only a vampire could. She was dressed in a gown that seemed to be made from captured moonlight, her platinum hair adorned with diamonds that sparkled like stars, her presence commanding even in the crowded hall. "Your Majesty," I said, bowing quickly, my heart racing. Being addressed by the queen was always unnerving, but something about her tone tonight set my instincts on edge. "Walk with me," she commanded, already moving toward one of the side corridors. I followed, having no real choice, and we left the celebration behind, walking in silence through the crystal passages until we reached a private balcony overlooking the vampire city below. The view was breathtaking, thousands of lights spread out in the darkness, crystalline architecture glowing with magic, vampires moving through the streets in celebration of their sacred day. Above, stars shone with impossible brightness in a sky so clear it looked like polished obsidian. "Do you know why I allowed you to remain in this palace?" Seraphine asked, her voice quiet but clear in the cold night air. "Because I saved your daughter's life," I replied carefully. "Because you believed I could help facilitate the peace treaty. Because I wanted to understand what makes you different," she interrupted. "What quality you possess that made you risk everything for a stranger, that made my daughter search for you for 5 years, that made her defy centuries of tradition to embrace you in front of the entire court. I wanted to see if you were truly special, or if you were simply a convenient fantasy for a traumatized girl trying to make sense of her suffering." I felt my jaw tighten but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I've watched you these past months," Seraphine went on, her gaze fixed on the city below. "I've seen how you work with Lyra, how you speak to my guards, how you navigate the complexities of vampire politics with surprising grace for someone who knew nothing of our ways. I've observed how the court has slowly begun to accept your presence, how even the most traditional nobles have started to see value in the bridges you're building between our peoples." She paused, and when she continued, her voice held a note of something that might have been approval. "You've proven yourself to be more than I expected, Kale Theron. You've shown wisdom, patience, and a genuine commitment to peace that goes beyond mere diplomatic duty. You've made yourself valuable to this court, to this realm. And in doing so, you've made the situation significantly more complicated." My heart was pounding now, sensing that we were approaching the real point of this conversation. Complicated how, Your Majesty? Seraphine turned to face me then, her crimson eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. Because I can see what's happening between you and my daughter. I can see the way you look at each other when you think no one is watching. I can see the love that's growing despite every logical reason it shouldn't. And I can see that if I force her to marry Lord Draven, if I choose political expediency over her happiness, I will break something in her that can never be repaired. I felt hope surge in my chest, but I forced myself to remain cautious. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'm faced with an impossible choice, she said, and for the first time since I had met her, I heard genuine vulnerability in her voice. As a queen, I should approve Draven's proposal. The alliance he offers would strengthen the realm, would secure the loyalty of the eastern provinces, would be the logical, responsible decision. But as a mother, her voice caught and she looked away, her perfect composure cracking slightly. As a mother, I remember what it felt like to be young and in love, to believe that the world could be changed if only we were brave enough to try. I remember choosing duty over desire, accepting a political marriage to a vampire I respected but did not love, spending centuries wondering what might have been if I had only had the courage to fight for what I truly wanted. She turned back to me, and I was shocked to see the faintest shimmer of tears in her ancient eyes. I don't want that for Lyra. I don't want her to spend eternity regretting, wondering, mourning the love she sacrificed for the sake of tradition. But I also can't ignore the risks. If I allow this, if I permit a vampire princess to be with a human, not as a political arrangement but as genuine partners, it could cause scandal, division, possibly even rebellion among the more traditional factions. It could endanger everything we've worked to build. Or it could be the foundation for something greater, I said quietly. Your Majesty, with respect, the peace between our peoples will never be truly stable as long as it's based only on treaties and trade agreements. Those things are important, but they're fragile. They can be broken when circumstances change or when someone decides the benefits no longer outweigh the costs. But if that peace is also based on genuine connection, on relationships that cross the divide between human and vampire, on love that transcends species, that's something much harder to break. That's something that could last for generations. Seraphine was silent for a long moment, considering my words. Then slowly she smiled, a small, sad smile that held centuries of wisdom and regret. You argue well for a human. My daughter chose better than she knew. She sighed, the sound carrying the weight of 1,000 years. Very well, Kael Theron. I will give you a chance. But understand, it is only a chance and you will have to earn it. Tell me what I need to do, I said immediately. The Grand Council convenes in 2 weeks, she explained. Representatives from all the major vampire houses will gather to discuss matters of state, including Lord Draven's proposal for marriage to Lyra. Tradition dictates that I present the proposal to the council for their approval, and unless there are compelling reasons to refuse, that approval is typically granted. However, her eyes glinted with something that might have been cunning. If an alternative proposal were to be presented, one that offered equal or greater benefits to the realm, the council would be obligated to consider both options and vote on which they believe serves the kingdom better. Understanding dawned. You want me to present an alternative? To propose an alliance based on my relationship with Lyra? I want you to prove that what you offer is worth the risk, Seraphine corrected. I want you to show the council that a union between human and vampire, your union with my daughter, can bring stability, prosperity, and strength to Crystal Mere. I want you to make them believe that tradition is sometimes worth breaking for the sake of progress. Can you do that? I thought about everything Lyra and I had accomplished in the past months. The treaties we had negotiated, the bridges we had built, the grudging respect we had earned from even the most skeptical members of the court. I thought about the human merchants now trading freely in vampire markets, the scholars sharing knowledge across species lines, the guards who had learned to see each other as allies rather than potential enemies. Yes, I said firmly. I can do that. But I'll need help. I'll need Lyra, and I'll need allies in the council willing to speak in our favor. The allies you will have to secure yourself, Seraphine said. I cannot be seen to favor your proposal over Draven's. I must remain neutral for the council to accept my judgment of the final decision. But as for Lyra, she paused, something that might have been affection softening her features. Tell her. Tell her everything. Make your plans together. You've proven you work well as a team. Continue to do so. Thank you, Your Majesty, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. I swear to you I will not fail. I will prove that what Lyra and I have is worth fighting for. See that you do, Seraphine replied, her expression hardening back into her queenly mask. Because if you fail, if the council rejects your proposal and approves Draven's, I will have no choice but to honor their decision. And Lyra will marry him, and you will return to the human lands, and what might have been between you will remain forever in the realm of dreams. Do you understand? I understand, I said, though the thought of losing Lyra, of being sent away and never seeing her again, felt like death. Seraphine nodded once, then turned to leave. She paused at the doorway, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For what it's worth, Kale Theron, I hope you succeed. My daughter deserves happiness, and I believe, she hesitated, then continued quietly, I believe you might actually be capable of giving it to her. And then she was gone, leaving me alone on the balcony with the weight of an entire kingdom's future resting on my shoulders and hope burning fierce and bright in my chest. I found Lyra in the library, her favorite refuge in the palace, a vast chamber filled with books and scrolls spanning thousands of years of vampire and human history. She was sitting in a reading alcove tucked between towering shelves, a book forgotten in her lap, staring into space with an expression that made my heart ache. Lyra, I called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and her face transformed the moment she saw me. The melancholy gave way to joy, then concern as she registered something in my expression. Kale? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I crossed to her quickly, checking to make sure we were alone before sitting beside her on the cushioned bench. I've just spoken with your mother. Lyra, we have a chance. A real chance. Her eyes widened. What do you mean? I told her everything, the Queen's confession about her own past regrets, the opportunity to present an alternative proposal to the Grand Council, the challenge to prove that our union would benefit the realm more than Draven's. Lyra listened with growing amazement, her hand finding mine and gripping it tightly as I spoke. She's actually giving us permission to fight for this? Lyra breathed when I finished. My mother, who has never broken a tradition in her entire life, is allowing us to challenge a formal marriage proposal from a powerful noble house? She's giving us a chance, I clarified. Whether we succeed or fail is up to us. We have 2 weeks to prepare a proposal that will convince the Grand Council that our relationship offers more value to Crystalmere than a political alliance with the eastern provinces. No pressure. Lyra laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that was part joy and part terror. No pressure at all. Just the future of our entire relationship, the stability of the realm, and the judgment of the most powerful vampires in the kingdom. Simple. We can do this, I said firmly, taking both her hands in mine. We've already accomplished so much. We just need to show the council what we've built, what we can continue to build. We need to make them see that love between human and vampire isn't a weakness or a scandal, it's a strength. It's the future. She looked at me with such fierce love and determination that it took my breath away. Then let's build the most compelling proposal the Grand Council has ever seen. Let's show them what we're capable of when we work together. Let's prove that some traditions are worth breaking. We spent the next 2 weeks in a flurry of preparation. We compiled evidence of every successful collaboration between human and vampire that had occurred since my arrival, trade agreements that had enriched both sides, cultural exchanges that had fostered understanding, joint defense initiatives that had made the borders safer. We gathered testimonials from merchants and scholars and guards who had benefited from the new policies we had helped implement. We reached out to progressive members of the vampire court, nobles who had expressed interest in reform and closer ties with human kingdoms. Some agreed to speak in our favor before the council. Others declined, too afraid of the social consequences, but their private words of support gave us hope. We studied precedents, searching through ancient records for any examples of cross-species unions in vampire history. We found a handful, mostly from the early days of vampire civilization, before traditions had calcified into rigid law, and we analyzed what had made those relationships successful and what benefits they had brought to the realm. And in the rare moments when we weren't working, when exhaustion forced us to pause, we simply held each other, drawing strength from our connection, reminding ourselves why we were fighting so hard. "Whatever happens," Lyra said one night, her head resting on my shoulder as we sat in the garden beneath the luminescent trees, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You've given me something I never thought I could have, the freedom to be myself, to be seen and valued not for my title or my bloodline but for who I actually am. Even if the council rejects our proposal, even if we have to say goodbye, I will never regret the time we've had." "We're not going to say goodbye," I said fiercely, pulling her closer. "I refuse to accept that. We're going to walk into that council chamber and we're going to make them understand what we have and we're going to win. And then we're going to spend the rest of our lives, however long or short that might be, building something beautiful together." "I love your optimism," she murmured, "even when it borders on delusion." "It's not delusion," I insisted. "It's hope. And hope is what got us this far. Hope is what made a wounded boy attack armed cultists to save a stranger. Hope is what made a traumatized princess search for 5 years to find someone she glimpsed in the darkness. Hope is what's going to carry us through this council meeting and out the other side together." She lifted her head to look at me, her crimson eyes shining with tears and love and determination. "Then let's give them hope too. Let's show the council that the future doesn't have to be bound by the past, that change is possible, that love can be stronger than tradition." "Together," I agreed. "Always," she promised. The day of the Grand Council meeting arrived with the weight of destiny. The council chamber was different from the throne hall, smaller, more intimate, but no less imposing. It was circular, with tiered seating rising around a central floor where petitioners and speakers would stand. The walls were made of the same translucent ice as the rest of the palace, but here they were carved with scenes from vampire history, great battles and treaties, the founding of kingdoms and the fall of empires, all rendered in precise detail that seemed to move in the shifting light. The council members filed in, representatives from every major vampire house in Crystalmere and beyond. They wore formal robes marking their status and house allegiance, and they took their seats with the practiced ease of immortals who had attended countless such meetings over the centuries. Queen Seraphine sat at the highest point, in a seat that was not quite a throne but clearly marked her as the ultimate authority, neutral but commanding. Lyra sat to her mother's right, as was her privilege as heir. She wore a gown of midnight blue and silver, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that incorporated her crown, her expression perfectly composed despite the tension I knew she was feeling. We had agreed that I would present our proposal while she observed, maintaining the appearance of proper royal dignity, but her presence was my anchor, my reminder of what I was fighting for. Lord Draven sat in the section reserved for petitioners, looking confident and relaxed. His proposal had already been circulated to the council members, and by all accounts, it had been received favorably. He caught my eye as I entered and smiled, a predatory expression that made it clear he considered this a formality, a foregone conclusion. I took my place in the petitioners section, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. I had spoken before crowds before, had negotiated with officials and nobles in my role as an envoy, but never had the stakes been so high, never had I stood before an audience of immortal beings whose decision would determine the course of my entire future. The council came to order, and Queen Seraphine spoke, her voice carrying easily through the chamber. "We are gathered to consider a matter of significant importance to the realm. Lord Draven of the Eastern Provinces has formally proposed a marriage alliance with Princess Lyra, heir to the throne of Crystalmere. As is tradition, the Grand Council will hear arguments for and against this proposal, will deliberate and will render judgment. Lord Draven, you may present your case." Draven rose with practiced grace and moved to the center of the chamber. His presentation was polished and professional, exactly what one would expect from a noble who had been preparing for political maneuvering his entire life. He spoke of the wealth his house would bring to the crown, the military forces he could contribute, the strategic advantages of binding the eastern provinces more firmly through marriage. He presented scrolls and documents, trade projections and defense analyses, all carefully prepared to demonstrate the tangible benefits of his proposal. He spoke for nearly an hour and I had to admit it was compelling. If one looked only at the practical advantages, the political logic, the material benefits, Draven's proposal was nearly impossible to argue against. But we weren't arguing against it. We were offering something different, something better. When Draven finished, Seraphine's gaze turned to me. Kael Theron, as a formal guest of the royal house and as someone with intimate knowledge of the matter at hand, you have requested permission to address the council with an alternative proposal. Permission is granted. Speak. I stood, feeling the weight of hundreds of crimson eyes upon me, and walked to the center of the chamber. For a moment, I simply breathed, centering myself, finding the calm core beneath the nerves. Then I began. Honored members of the Grand Council, I stand before you as a human in a vampire court, an outsider seeking to address matters that have been the province of your people for millennia. I acknowledge that my presence here is unusual, perhaps even controversial. But I ask that you hear me not as a human or an outsider, but as someone who has come to care deeply about Crystalmere and its future, and who believes that I have something valuable to offer. I paused, letting that sink in, then continued. Lord Draven has presented a compelling case for a traditional alliance based on political expediency and material gain. These are important considerations and I do not dismiss them. But I would like to present an alternative vision, a proposal based not on what has been done in the past, but on what could be possible in the future. I activated the magical projection device we had prepared, and images began appearing in the air above the chamber floor. Scenes of human merchants trading in vampire markets, vampire scholars teaching in human universities, mixed patrols of human and vampire guards protecting shared borders. Since my arrival in Crystalmere 4 months ago, Princess Lyra and I have worked together to implement a series of initiatives designed to foster closer cooperation between human and vampire populations. The results have exceeded our most optimistic projections. Trade between our peoples has increased by 40%, bringing new wealth to both human and vampire merchants. Cultural exchanges have led to breakthroughs in both magic and technology that neither species could have achieved alone. Crime along the border regions has decreased by 60% due to joint patrol initiatives. I let the images change, showing faces, vampires and humans smiling together, working together, building something new together. But more important than these numbers are the relationships being formed. Vampires who once viewed humans with suspicion or disdain are now forming friendships, partnerships, even bonds of genuine affection with human colleagues. Humans who grew up fearing vampires as monsters are discovering that you are people, with hopes and dreams and the same capacity for good and evil that exists in all sentient beings. I turned to face the council directly, meeting as many eyes as I could. What Princess Lyra and I have demonstrated through our collaboration is that human-vampire cooperation is not only possible but beneficial. We have proven that our species can work together, can trust each other, can create something greater than either could achieve alone. And now we propose taking that cooperation to its logical conclusion, a formal union that would symbolize and strengthen the bonds being forged between our peoples. Murmurs ran through the council, some shocked, some intrigued, some clearly disapproving. I pressed on before opposition could coalesce. I am not a lord with vast wealth or armies to offer. I cannot provide the immediate material benefits that Lord Draven's proposal promises. But what I can offer is something potentially more valuable, a genuine bridge between human and vampire civilizations. As the human partner of your princess, I would serve as a living symbol of cooperation and unity, a demonstration that the divisions between our species can be overcome. I would facilitate deeper diplomatic ties with human kingdoms, would help negotiate trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, would work tirelessly to ensure that the peace we have begun to build continues to grow and flourish. The images above shifted again, showing projections we had carefully developed, potential future scenarios based on current trends. If we continue on our current path of cooperation, Economic models suggest that combined human-vampire prosperity could increase by as much as 200% within a decade. Shared research initiatives could lead to magical and technological advances that would benefit both species for generations. And perhaps most importantly, the cultural understanding being developed would make future conflicts far less likely, as it's much harder to go to war with people you know and respect as individuals. I took a breath, preparing for the most personal part of my speech. But beyond politics and economics, beyond strategy and projections, there is another factor to consider: the happiness and well-being of Princess Lyra herself. She is not merely a tool for political alliance. She is a person, an individual with feelings and desires that matter. She has already sacrificed so much for this realm, has endured trauma and fear and years of searching for someone she believed she might never find. And now that she has found me, now that we have discovered a genuine connection that brings both of us joy and purpose, I believe she deserves the chance to choose her own future. I looked up at Lyra then, saw her eyes shining with tears and pride and love, saw her mother watching with an expression of carefully controlled emotion. "I love Princess Lyra," I said simply, letting the words ring through the chamber. "I love her not because she is a princess or because of what she can offer me, but because of who she is, brave and kind and fierce and gentle, brilliant and funny and so determined to make her world better despite all the obstacles in her path. I love her, and she loves me, and we believe that our love can be the foundation for something greater than either of us alone. We believe it can be the foundation for a new era of human-vampire cooperation, for a future where our children and our children's children will grow up in a world where species doesn't define possibility, where love isn't constrained by tradition, where peace is built not just on treaties but on genuine understanding and affection." I spread my hands, a gesture of openness and vulnerability. "So I ask you, honored council members, to consider not just what has been done in the past, but what could be possible in the future. I ask you to take a risk on something new, something unprecedented, something that could change the course of history. I ask you to approve my union with Princess Lyra, not despite the fact that I am human, but because of it, because what we represent together is more valuable than anything either of us could offer alone." I fell silent, my speech complete, and returned to my seat. The chamber erupted in conversation, council members debating and arguing, voices rising and falling in waves. I couldn't tell if I had swayed them or simply confirmed their prejudices. I had said everything I could think to say, had poured my heart into words and hoped they would be enough. Now all I could do was wait. Queen Seraphine called for order, and slowly the council chamber quieted. "The arguments have been heard," she announced. "The council will now deliberate and vote. All members in favor of Lord Draven's proposal, signify by raising your hand." I watched, my heart in my throat, as hands rose around the chamber. I counted them compulsively: 10, 15, 20, 25. When the count finished, slightly more than a third of the council had voted in Draven's favor. It was significant, but not a majority. "All members in favor of Cale Theron's proposal," Seraphine continued, her voice carefully neutral. More hands rose and I felt hope surge in my chest. 30, 35, 40. The count climbed higher than Draven's, and I saw the vampire lord's confident expression crack slightly, concern flickering across his features. But when the count finished, we still didn't have a majority. Close, achingly close, but not quite enough. Members abstaining from the vote? The remaining hands rose, a smaller group but still significant. They had been swayed by neither proposal, or perhaps they were simply too afraid to choose a side in such a contentious matter. Seraphine surveyed the chamber, her expression grave. "The council is split, with no clear majority for either proposal. In such circumstances, tradition grants the ruling monarch the authority to cast the deciding vote. However, given the personal nature of this matter and my desire to remain impartial, I will instead call for individual testimonies. Council members who abstained, you will have the opportunity to hear additional arguments from both petitioners and from Princess Lyra herself, after which you will cast your final votes. This is irregular, but then so is the entire situation." She turned her gaze to her daughter. "Lyra, you have remained silent throughout these proceedings, as is proper for one in your position. But this decision affects your life more than anyone else's. I ask you now, what do you wish? Speak freely and let the council hear your voice." Lyra rose, and every eye in the chamber fixed on her. She descended from her elevated seat with perfect grace, moving to the center of the floor where Draven and I had spoken. For a moment she simply stood there, collecting her thoughts, and I saw her transform from the composed princess into something more, something raw and real and powerful. "Honored council members," she began, her voice strong and clear, "I have been groomed since birth to understand that my life is not entirely my own. I have been taught that duty comes before desire, that the needs of the realm outweigh personal happiness, that a princess must always think first of her people and never of herself. And I have accepted these teachings. I have tried to be the daughter my mother needs, the heir Crystalmere deserves, the symbol of our ancient bloodline and traditions." She paused, and I saw emotion flicker across her face, pain and determination and desperate hope. "But I would ask you to consider what kind of realm we are building if we continue to believe that duty and happiness are mutually exclusive. What kind of future are we creating if we teach our children that love is something to be sacrificed for political convenience? What message do we send to our people if we demonstrate that individual feelings and desires don't matter, that we are all merely pieces to be moved on a board in service of some abstract concept of tradition?" She turned slowly, making eye contact with as many council members as she could. "5 years ago I was tortured and nearly killed by fanatics who saw me as nothing more than a source of power. I survived only because a human boy, a child who should have been thinking only of his own survival, chose to value my life over his own. He didn't know who I was. He didn't know what reward might come from saving me. He simply saw someone who needed help, and he helped at great cost to himself. That is the nature of the man you are being asked to judge today." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Cale Theron has proven himself 100 times over since arriving in this palace. He has worked tirelessly to build bridges between our peoples. He has earned the respect of our guards, our scholars, our merchants. He has facilitated agreements that have enriched our realm and strengthened our position. He has asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to continue serving, to continue building, to continue proving that human and vampire can work together toward common goals." She looked directly at the abstaining council members. "But more than his accomplishments, more than his diplomatic skills or his dedication to peace, what matters is this: he loves me. Genuinely, completely, without reservation or hidden motive. He sees me not as a princess or a political opportunity, but as Lyra, a person with flaws and strengths, fears and dreams. He makes me laugh. He challenges me to think differently. He supports me when I'm struggling and celebrates my victories as if they were his own. He makes me want to be better, to do more, to believe that the world can change if we have the courage to push it." Tears rolled down her cheeks, glowing slightly in the cold light, and she made no attempt to hide them. "I love him. I love him with every part of my being, with an intensity that terrifies me, with a certainty that feels like destiny. And I truly believe, that if you allow us to be together we can build something extraordinary. We can show both our peoples that love is stronger than prejudice, that cooperation is more valuable than isolation, that the future doesn't have to be bound by the past." She drew herself up to her full height, every inch a princess, every word ringing with royal authority. "So I ask you, council members, not as your future queen but as a woman who has endured suffering and found unexpected joy, please don't make me choose between duty and love. Please don't force me to sacrifice my happiness for tradition when I have already sacrificed so much. Please allow me to be both the Princess Crystalmere needs and the woman I want to be. Give me permission to build a future with the man I love, and I swear to you, I will use that happiness to serve this realm more effectively than I ever could while nursing a broken heart and lifelong regrets." She turned to her mother, and her voice dropped to something softer but no less powerful. "Mother, you told me once that you chose duty over desire, that you accepted a political marriage and spent centuries wondering what might have been. I know you did it because you loved your people, because you believed it was necessary for the realm's survival. But I also know it cost you something precious, something you can never reclaim. I'm asking you, I'm begging you, don't make me pay that same price. Let this generation be different. Let love be worth fighting for. The chamber was absolutely silent as Lyra finished speaking. Even the most traditional rigid council members seemed moved by her words, and I saw several of the abstaining vampires exchanging glances, reconsidering. Seraphine stood, descending from her elevated seat with slow, measured steps. She crossed to her daughter, and for a moment mother and daughter simply looked at each other, centuries of royal tradition and duty warring with maternal love and the memory of past regrets. Then, slowly, the queen reached out and cupped her daughter's face in her hands, a gesture of tenderness that shocked the entire assembly. "My precious child," Seraphine said softly, though her voice still carried through the chamber. "You asked me to break tradition, to risk scandal and potential division, to permit something that has not been done in millennia. You asked me to choose your happiness over political expediency, to value love over alliance, to believe that the future can be different from the past." She paused and I saw tears, actual tears, forming in the ancient queen's eyes. "And I find that I cannot refuse you. Because you are right. I did make that choice all those centuries ago and I have regretted it every day since. I built a strong realm, yes, but I built it on the ashes of my own dreams, and that is not the legacy I want to leave you. I want you to have what I could not: the courage to choose love, the strength to forge your own path, the freedom to be both a queen and a woman." She turned to address the council, still holding her daughter's face, her voice ringing with royal authority mixed with maternal passion. "I vote in favor of Cale Theron's proposal. I vote to allow my daughter to marry for love, to permit a union that breaks tradition but builds bridges, to approve an alliance based not on wealth or armies but on genuine affection and shared purpose. And I call upon the abstaining members to consider carefully, do you want to be part of a council that clings to the past, or one that has the courage to embrace the future?" The silence that followed was profound. Then one by one the abstaining council members began to stand, raising their hands in support. Not all of them, some still held back, too afraid or too rigid to change. But enough. More than enough. When the final count was tallied, the vote was clear. Cale Theron's proposal had passed. I felt my knees go weak with relief, felt tears burning in my eyes, felt my heart threatening to burst from my chest. It was over. We had won. Against all odds, against tradition and prejudice and logical objections, we had actually won. Lyra broke free from her mother and ran to me, propriety forgotten, and I caught her in my arms as she crashed into me, both of us laughing and crying at the same time. I held her tight, burying my face in her silver hair, breathing in her scent, feeling the reality of our victory slowly sinking in. "We did it," she whispered against my chest. "We actually did it." "We did," I agreed, pulling back just enough to look at her face, to see the joy and relief and love shining in her crimson eyes. "Together. Always together," she said, and then she kissed me there in the center of the council chamber, in front of hundreds of vampire nobles and her mother and everyone who had doubted us, and I kissed her back with all the love and hope and fierce determination that had carried us to this moment. The chamber erupted in applause, not universal but loud enough to shake the crystal walls. I heard cheers and congratulations, heard even some of the skeptical council members admitting that they were moved, heard the future reshaping itself in real time. When we finally broke apart, breathless and grinning like fools, Queen Seraphine stood before us, her expression soft with maternal affection mixed with royal dignity. "Cale Theron," she said formally, "I hereby grant you permission to enter into a formal union with Princess Lyra, heir to the throne of Crystal Mere. You will be recognized as a prince consort, a formal representative of the human kingdoms, and a valued member of the royal house. Your duties will include continuing to foster cooperation between our peoples, serving as an advisor on matters concerning human relations, and, most importantly, making my daughter happy for as long as you both shall live. Do you accept these responsibilities?" "I do, Your Majesty," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "With all my heart." She nodded, then turned to Lyra. "And you, my daughter, are you certain this is the path you wish to take? There will be challenges ahead, obstacles we haven't even imagined yet. There will be those who judge you, who question your choices, who believe you have made a mistake. Are you prepared to face that together?" Lyra took my hand, lacing her fingers through mine, and met her mother's gaze with unwavering certainty. I am mother. Because love is worth fighting for. Because some traditions deserve to be broken. And because I believe that the story Kale and I will write together will be greater than anything either of us could have written alone. Seraphine smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her ageless face into something warm and almost human. Then let it be so. Let the historians record that on this day, tradition was bent but not broken, that love was valued alongside duty, and that the future of Crystalmere was forever changed by the courage of two people who refused to accept that different species could not find common ground. She raised her voice to address the full council. Let the preparations begin for a royal wedding, the first union between vampire princess and human partner in over 3,000 years. Let messengers be sent to all the kingdoms, both vampire and human, announcing this new alliance. And let it be known that Crystalmere enters a new era, one where the old walls between our peoples begin to crumble, where cooperation is valued over isolation, where love proves itself stronger than fear. The council responded with applause and cheers, and I felt Lyra squeeze my hand tightly, anchoring us both in this impossible moment. We had done it. Against all odds, against tradition and prejudice and logical objections, we had proven that love could bridge the divide between species, that courage could reshape destiny, that two people who should never have met could change the course of history. And this, I realized as I looked at Lyra's radiant face, at the joy in her crimson eyes and the hope written in every line of her smile. This was only the beginning. The palace gardens had been transformed for the celebration. Thousands of luminescent flowers had been cultivated specifically for this occasion, blooming in colors that didn't exist in nature, shades of violet and silver and gold that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Crystal arches had been erected throughout the space, each one carved with scenes from the past year. The wedding ceremony that had united human and vampire in ways not seen for millennia, the diplomatic summits that had followed, the cultural exchanges and trade fairs and countless small moments of connection between peoples who had once been enemies. I stood at the edge of the celebration, watching vampires and humans mingling freely, laughing together, dancing to music that blended both traditions. It still felt surreal sometimes, this new world we had helped create. There had been challenges, of course, there still were. Not everyone had embraced the changes. Some vampire houses had refused to participate in the new cultural exchange programs. Some human kingdoms had expressed concern about what they saw as dangerous fraternization with monsters. There had been incidents, conflicts, setbacks that had tested our resolve and our relationship. But we had persevered. Together, always together, Lyra and I had worked to prove that our union was more than symbolic, that genuine cooperation between our peoples was possible and beneficial. We had traveled to human kingdoms and vampire territories, speaking with skeptics and celebrating with supporters, using our story to inspire others to look past centuries of prejudice and fear. And slowly, gradually, the world had begun to change. "There you are," a familiar voice said, and I turned to find Lyra approaching, radiant in a gown of starlight and shadow that seemed to shift between human and vampire aesthetics. She wore her crown, a new design incorporating both ice crystals and human metalwork, and her silver hair was arranged in a style that had become popular among both species, a blend of traditions that neither side would have imagined before. "Just taking a moment to appreciate what we've built," I said, pulling her close and pressing a kiss to her forehead. "1 year ago we were fighting for the right to be together. Now look at this, hundreds of people, human and vampire, celebrating together without fear or hatred. It's extraordinary." "It is," she agreed, leaning into my embrace, her cool skin no longer startling but comforting, familiar home. "Though Mother would say we're only getting started. She's already planning another dozen initiatives to deepen the integration between our peoples. I think breaking her own rule about tradition has unleashed something in her. She's become quite the reformer." I laughed, glancing across the garden to where Queen Seraphine was deep in conversation with the human king of the southern territories, my former ruler, now our ally. The sight of them talking as equals, planning jointly for the future of both their peoples, would have been impossible a year ago. "She's making up for lost time, I think." proving that it's never too late to change, never too late to choose differently. Speaking of choosing differently, Lyra said, pulling back slightly to look up at me with an expression that was both nervous and excited, I have something to tell you. Something I've been waiting for the right moment to share. My heart rate picked up, sensing that whatever she was about to say was significant. What is it? She took my hand and placed it over her abdomen, and I felt my eyes widen as understanding dawned. Are you? Is it possible? I thought vampires and humans couldn't. Apparently, when love is strong enough, when the bond between two people transcends the normal boundaries, when magic and emotion and sheer stubborn determination combine, anything is possible, she said, her eyes shining with tears of joy. The healers confirmed it this morning. I'm pregnant, Kale. We're going to have a child. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she was saying. A child. A baby born of human and vampire, a living symbol of everything we had fought for, everything we had proven possible. A bridge not just between our current peoples but between future generations, carrying the potential for a new kind of existence that belonged fully to neither world and somehow to both. My voice broke and I found myself laughing and crying at the same time, pulling Lyra into a tight embrace. That's impossible and perfect and terrifying and the most wonderful thing I've ever heard. I know, she said, laughing too, her tears soaking into my formal jacket. I'm terrified. I have no idea what to expect, how the pregnancy will work, whether the child will be more vampire or more human or something entirely new. But I'm also so happy, Kale. So incredibly, impossibly happy. We'll figure it out, I promised, pulling back to cup her face in my hands, looking into those crimson eyes that had captivated me from the first moment I saw them. Together, like we figured out everything else. We'll learn and adapt and make mistakes and find our way. And our child will grow up in a world that's better than the one we inherited, a world where love matters more than species, where cooperation is valued over conflict, where the old boundaries are dissolving to make room for something new. Our child, she repeated, testing out the words, a smile spreading across her face that was pure joy. The first of a new generation. The first of many, perhaps, if our example inspires others. Can you imagine, Kale? In a few decades, there could be dozens, hundreds of families like ours. Children who grow up never knowing a time when humans and vampires were enemies, who see the differences between our peoples as interesting variations rather than insurmountable divisions. That's the world we're building, I agreed. Not just for ourselves but for them. For our child and all the children who will come after, who will inherit the future we're creating. We stood there in the garden, holding each other, while around us the celebration continued, humans and vampires dancing together, laughing together, building friendships and alliances that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. The palace that had once felt cold and alien now felt like home, filled with warmth and light and possibility. Queen Seraphine noticed us and made her way over, her expression transforming from regal composure to maternal joy as she saw our tears and understood without being told what they meant. A grandchild, she breathed, reaching out to embrace both of us. Oh, my dears. Words fail me. This is the greatest gift, the most perfect symbol of everything we've achieved and everything we hope to achieve. A new life, born of love that transcended every obstacle we placed in its path. We're terrified, Lyra admitted, laughing through her tears. Good, Seraphine said firmly. All good parents are terrified. It means you understand the magnitude of the responsibility, the preciousness of what you've created. But you will not face this alone. You have family, both vampire and human, who will support you, guide you, help you navigate whatever challenges arise. And you have each other, which is the most important thing. She stepped back, looking at both of us with pride and love and something that might have been awe. When you first walked into my throne hall, Kale Theron, I saw you as a potential problem, a complication that might upset the careful balance of power I had maintained for centuries. But you proved to be something else entirely, a catalyst for change, a force for good, a man with enough courage and stubbornness to challenge an entire kingdom's worth of tradition and emerge victorious. My daughter chose well. Thank you, Your Majesty, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. For giving us a chance. For choosing love over logic. For being brave enough to break the patterns of the past. Thank you for being worth the risk, she replied. Now go enjoy your celebration. Dance with your wife, celebrate your news with those who love you, and know that the future you've created is bright beyond measure. We did exactly that. We danced beneath the glowing crystal arches while magical musicians played melodies that blended human and vampire traditions. We shared our news with friends and allies, watching their faces light up with joy and wonder. We accepted congratulations and blessings from people who had once questioned whether our relationship could work, who now saw us as living proof that love could overcome any obstacle. And late that night, when the celebration finally wound down and we retired to our chambers, quarters that we had redecorated together, mixing vampire and human aesthetics into something uniquely ours, we lay together in comfortable silence, my hand resting on Lyra's abdomen where our impossible child was growing. I love you, I said softly, the words inadequate for the depth of emotion I felt but the only ones available. I love you too, she replied, her cool fingers interlacing with mine. Thank you for being foolish and brave enough to save a girl you didn't know. Thank you for staying when you could have left. Thank you for fighting for us when the entire world said it was impossible. Thank you for giving me a future worth living, a love worth cherishing, and now a child to protect and raise and love together. Thank you for seeing worth in a wounded boy who stumbled into a dark chamber, I countered. Thank you for searching for me when you had every reason to give up. Thank you for running to me in that throne hall and shattering every expectation, every rule, every tradition that said we couldn't be together. Thank you for being brave enough to love me despite all the complications and challenges. We're quite the pair, aren't we? She said, laughing softly. Two stubborn fools who refuse to accept that love has limits, who insisted on proving that the impossible is just the difficult waiting to be achieved. The best kind of fools, I agreed. The kind who change the world. Outside our window, the vampire city glowed with thousands of lights, and in the distance, I could see campfires from human settlements that had been established in the previously off-limits territories, part of the integration initiatives we had championed. Two worlds slowly becoming one, barriers dissolving, understanding growing, fear giving way to curiosity and then to friendship and sometimes even to love. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. There would always be those who clung to old prejudices, who feared change, who believed that species should remain separate. There would be setbacks and conflicts and moments when it felt like all our progress was slipping away. But we had proven something fundamental, something that could never be unproven, that human and vampire could love each other, could build a life together, could create something new and beautiful from the union of two seemingly incompatible worlds. And our child, when they came, would be living proof of that truth, a new kind of existence that belonged to both worlds and to neither, carrying within them the potential for a future brighter than anything our ancestors could have imagined. I pulled Lyra closer, feeling her cool body against mine, our hearts beating in complementary rhythms, hers slow and measured, mine quick and warm, together creating a harmony that shouldn't have been possible but undeniably was. The entire palace froze when you ran and hugged me, I murmured, remembering that first day, the shock on every face, the impossible moment when everything changed. Best decision I ever made, Lyra replied, tilting her head to kiss me softly. Best decision we both made, to be brave, to be foolish, to believe that love is stronger than fear. Always, I promised. Forever, she agreed. And there, in the heart of the frozen palace that had become our home, in the realm that had become our shared responsibility, with the future growing beneath our joined hands, there we slept, two impossible lovers who had changed the world simply by refusing to accept that love has boundaries, that hope has limits, that the future must always resemble the past. We slept, and we dreamed of the child who would come, of the world they would inherit, of the story that would be told about the vampire princess and the human who loved her, who fought for her, who proved that when two souls connect deeply enough, when two hearts beat in harmony, nothing, not tradition, not prejudice, not the weight of millennia, can keep them apart. We slept, and the palace around us hummed with magic and life and the whisper of change, the promise of a future written not in the cold logic of political necessity but in the warm ink of love freely given and fiercely defended. We slept, together, always together, and it was enough. It was everything.